Sounds like a pretty thrilling game, and this is the kind of violence that critics are pretty worried about.
1991 would see the release of SNK's Fatal Fury and Capcom's Street Fighter II. Street Fighter especially would change arcades and gaming forever. Previously, gamers wanting to punch people in the face would lean towards the side-scrolling beat-em-up and not the one-on-one fighter. The competitive style of play gave people a different hook to chasing high scores as had been so popular through previous years in arcades. The games looked stunning and were at the cutting edge of what was possible with current technology. After a failed first entry, Street Fighter II had caused a tidal wave of new one-on-one fighters. Through the 90s and onwards, many companies would try their hand at creating a franchise to compete with Street Fighter in the one-on-one fighter space. Out of all the challengers to the throne, one stands out above all others. Midway, a company who had found their success in the late 1970s and early 1980s, distributing Space Invaders for Taito and Pac-Man for Namco, had been purchased by popular arcade and pinball developer Williams in the late 1980s. Two employees, John Tobias, known for his work on Smash TV and Total Carnage,
I've been playing video games since I was like 7 years old with Pong,
and Ed Boon, who had worked on various games, provided coding for pinball machines and even voiced Rudy on the Pat Lawler classic Funhouse, had been tasked with developing a one-on-one fighter in the space of less than a year to catch some of Street Fighter II's momentum, a huge task. The game's hook initially was that it would feature one of the biggest action stars at the time, Jean-Claude Van Damme, who had had massive success in recent years with the iconic movies Bloodsport and Kickboxer. The deal with him ultimately fell through due to his prior commitments for a Sega Mega Drive title, a game that never ended up seeing a release. After failing to find a decent title for their new fighter, legendary pinball designer and Williams employee Steve Ritchie came up with Mortal Kombat, and it stuck. Remarkably, a four-man development team created Mortal Kombat within 10 months, and August 9th, 1992 saw the game released in arcades. The game featured hugely eye-catching digitised graphics in place of Street Fighter's cartoon-like sprites. But the thing that really caught gamers' eyes was the extreme violence and gore that accompanied the game. Uppercuts were met with huge splashes of blood, the likes of which hadn't been seen in games before. Fighters could be knocked into spike pits, and the real game changer, fatality moves, turned everybody's heads.
Fatalities are just what happens if you're really brutal to your opponent. You get an opponent, you can rip off his head or something like that.
Sounds like a pretty thrilling game.
They would go on to cause huge controversy.
Fatality.
The state-of-the-art graphics featured real actors and stop-motion animation, which at the time were a revelation. Although digitised sprites had been used as far back as 1983's Journey, and in more recent titles including the bare-knuckle brawler Pit Fighter, this was the first time they'd really caught people's attention. My first experience of the game was as a 10-year-old boy in an old British seafront arcade in Lyme Regis. My parents had let us pop in as we walked past one evening for a look at the games, and the brand new Mortal Kombat machine in the corner caught my eye immediately. I'd seen the graphics, the blood, and even a pit fatality in my brief viewing, and I couldn't believe my eyes. I wouldn't get to play the game until weeks later, and this only added to the mystique. The hype was huge, and my friends and I were talking about the game constantly, and all the stuff you could do in it. We were already big Street Fighter fans, but this was something different altogether, and the game's visceral appeal was obvious. It was new, more adult, and at the time, more exciting. The game featured 7 playable fighters and 2 extra boss characters, one of which, Goro, has apparently remained undefeated for over 500 years. If you ever ploughed enough cash into the game as a kid and reached him, and his relentlessly unfair onslaught, you'd understand why.
Test your might.
Although Jean-Claude Van Damme didn't make it into the game, Johnny Cage, note the initials, did. And he is clearly based on the film star, right down to his outfit and even his Bloodsport the Splits move. Other characters include the fierce rivals Sub-Zero and Scorpion, the Thunder God Raiden, and female fighter Sonya Blade, who was added later when the developers decided the game needed a female character. The real fun with choosing who you would be came from whether you could pull off the game's mysterious fatalities.
Sonya wins.
In a time before the internet, playgrounds were full of kids gossiping about how to pull off the goriest of moves. With all this gore came controversy that went all the way to government level. Gone were the days of video games apparently destroying kids' brains through addiction. Now there was a new supposed threat from the images themselves that were being taken in.
Some makers say playing games with simulated violence may actually help some teenagers who can release pent-up feelings, a theory other witnesses disputed.
How would you like to have a teenage daughter go out on a date with someone who's just watched or played 3 hours of that game?
There was a shift in the way video games were perceived, and Mortal Kombat was directly responsible for the creation of the Entertainment Software Rating Board, which would mean in future all games would require a rating. The media were fueling parents' fear, and the argument ended up in Congress. Footage of Mortal Kombat along with Night Trap, another controversial 90s title, was shown in evidence. The game, along with others, was later ignorantly linked to high school shootings and other acts of violence.
It is a sick, disgusting video game in my judgment.
It gave politicians a new scapegoat alongside rap music and video nasties to blame for society's ills. The controversy, of course, only served to increase the game's notoriety and success. Following its arcade release, home console ports were inevitable. They would follow a year later on September 13th, 1993. The build-up to release was huge. Popular UK TV show Games Master had a special feature on the game.
With a very special edition of the show. The game is Mortal Kombat, the most eagerly awaited game of the year. 3 rounds of head-to-head beat-em-up action, with special moves aplenty and a few gruesome twists to look out for. Seconds out, or more appropriately, fight!
Magazines were plastered in previews, and the game's release date itself was dubbed Mortal Monday. My mail-order Mega Drive copy arrived that very day, and I was conveniently unwell and missed school to play it. The Mega Drive port was solid and most importantly retained, through the use of a code, the arcade version's blood. The blood was a big factor in the 16-bit console war at the time, as Nintendo, with their family-friendly approach, had insisted that the blood be removed from the Super Nintendo version, which was a real shame as the SNES port had better sound and graphics. Realising its importance, Nintendo would soften their stance towards the blood for the sequels. The two big hitting console developers both saw ports for their handhelds as well. And within 2 months the game had shipped 3 million copies. More ports would follow and the game went on to be a huge hit for Midway.
Scorpion and Sub-Zero. Deadliest of enemies, but slaves under my power.
Move aside.
Later, in 1995, a movie of the game was released. Although very much a product of its time, it's actually very entertaining and one of the better video game movies out there. Starring Christopher Lambert, who was well known at the time for Highlander, and Robin Shou, it received mixed reviews but grossed over $120 million and was very successful. I went to see it in my local cinema as a kid and I must admit, to this day, it's something of a guilty pleasure movie for me. Enough! Mortal Kombat would see a hugely successful sequel not long after. Released on nearly every platform, the game expanded on the original in every possible way. Extra characters and moves, better graphics and of course more fatalities, along with the introduction of friendship and babality moves.
Friendship?
More Mortal Kombat games would follow, along with several spin-offs. Other games tried to emulate its realistic and gory appeal, but none really measured up. Its legacy can't be underestimated. It changed the way people thought about games with its brilliantly enjoyable violent themes. After something of a lull when the game first transitioned into 3D, in recent years it's had a big resurgence, and the most recent outing, Mortal Kombat X, was extremely well received. Looking back, perhaps Mortal Kombat didn't offer the same quality of nuanced combat that Street Fighter II had, but it brought a lot of its own ideas, style and themes to the table. Fans obsess over its deep mythology and dark themes to this day. Such a brilliant and important series, and I'm happy that I was there on Mortal Monday, skiving off of school to play what would become one of my favourite games of all time.
Zero wins. Fatality.